Hi, I'm Alan Thurston, the author of It Ain't So, Shoeless Joe Jackson's Story, which consists of a two-act play and a 58-page afterword essay where I attempt to the best of my ability to make the case for Shoeless Joe Jackson. Like so many, first became interested in the story of the Black Sox scandal after reading Elliot Asanoff's book, 8 Men Out, way back in the 60s. In his 1935 article, I recall, famed baseball writer Hugh Fullerton wrote regarding the Black Sox scandal, quote, "Today, more than 15 years later, the full story never has been told and never will be, because Ban Johnson, the American League president, Charles Comiskey, the White Sox owner, and Alfred Austrian, the White Sox attorney, are dead. Then they were the only ones who knew it all. And now, over 100 years later, after the scandal, Fullerton, Jackson, and all the participants obviously are gone. So we're never going to know exactly what happened. But all we can do is evaluate the available evidence and make our own decision about what we think happened." Gene Carney was highly esteemed by both Joe defenders and detractors alike, and was the first chairman and founder of the Sabre Black Sox Scandal Research Committee, and also the author of a landmark book called Burying the Black Sox. He wrote that a case can be made either for or against Joe, whether he was innocent or guilty. A case can be made for him, a case can be made against him. Other interesting books that I have read are Donald Grotman's biography, Say It Ain't So, Joe. Also, there's a very interesting chapter in a book called The Faith of 50 Millions, written by William R. Herzog II, entitled From Scapegoat to Icon, The Strange Journey of Shoeless Joe Jackson. Another book that I like is Scandal on the South Side, which is edited by the current chairman of the Sabre Black Sox Scandal Research Committee, Jacob Pomranke. I especially like this book because it contains biographies of every player who played for the White Sox in 1990, which I found extremely interesting. And Mr. Pomranke and Dr. David Fletcher also are the editors of Joe Jackson versus Chicago American League Baseball Club, the transcript of Jackson's 1924 civil trial, where Joe sued White Sox owner Comiskey for back pay. Both Joe defenders and detractors alike owe Mr. Pomranke and Dr. Fletcher a huge debt of gratitude for getting this transcript published. I'm so glad that I got a chance to read it. They estimate that only maybe 10 people in 100 years had ever read the complete transcript. I'm so glad I got the chance to read it. Kudos to them. I will also be referring to an article that appeared in the baseball journal, Sabre Baseball Journal, an article entitled An Ever-Changing Story by William Lamb. The great Ted Williams fought ferociously for Joe Jackson, trying to get him reinstated into baseball so he could have a chance to be inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame at Cooperstown. And Joe has now been reinstated, so I think Ted Williams is smiling somewhere because of that. And now we have to wait to see. I think it's in December 2027. They're going to vote whether he gets in or not. And when he was asked why he was so passionate about the subject of Shoeless Joe Jackson, Williams said, quote, that he loved baseball so much that he can't believe baseball would ever have done anything wrong. But in Joe's case, maybe in Joe's case, it has done something unfair, end quote. In September 2019, I attended the Sabre Black Sox Scandal Centennial Celebration Symposium in Chicago. I had a very good time overall. There were many interesting panels and many distinguished panelists, but the one thing that really disappointed me was there were not one person on any of the panels defended Shoeless Joe Jackson. And Chairman Pomranke himself said on a podcast, quote, "One of the big reasons we are continuing to talk about this story 100 years later is because Jackson is the iconic star, a mythical figure, really." And end quote, I agree with that. I fully agree with that. And I would estimate 75 to 80% of the reason people are still interested in the Black Sox scandal to this day is because of Shoeless Joe Jackson. Say It Ain't So, Joe, in the films Field of Dreams and 8 Men Out. And I believe there is a case to be made for Joe, and it is only fair as to use Ted Williams' idea, it's only fair that it be heard, that Joe's case at least be heard. People can reject the case. They have every right to do so. But it should at least be considered and not ignored. Pomeranke has written that to Joe's supporters, Jackson's is a story of injustice. Gene Carty described him as a scapegoat, and Joe's Hall of Fame teammate, Eddie Collins, said he was a patsy. I plan to do 3 video presentations. Part 1 consists of 2 topics. Joe's performance in the 1919 World Series, and topic 2 is, he took the money. My second presentation, part 2, I will discuss Joe's 1920 grand jury testimony, and the third presentation, part 3, will be about Joe's 1924 civil trial. I doubt that there has ever been a performance in the history of the World Series by a baseball player that has been more analyzed, scrutinized, dissected than that of Shoeless Joe Jackson. Joe tied the record for the most hits, 12, in a World Series, a record that lasted 45 years. He made no errors, had 16 putouts, led his team in slugging percentage, scored 5, drove in 6 on a team that only scored 20. He moved up the most runners on his team. Joe himself said that he thought his performance in the 1919 World Series was the finest performance of his career, his career accomplishment of which he was most proud. However, not everyone has been impressed by Joe's stats in that World Series. In his article, An Ever-Changing Story, William Lamb writes, quote, superficially at least, Joe's series stats were considered outstanding, end quote. I don't think Joe's teammates who watched Joe's every at-bat, every play in the field, I don't believe they were watching superficially. Ray Schalk said Joe Jackson hit as hard as he did during the season, maybe even a little better. Eddie Collins said Jackson maintained his reputation with his stick. Outfielder Eddie Murphy stated, Jackson's hitting was wonderful. He was robbed of a number of hits by sensational fielding. But even so, he came through with many a timely clout. In addition, Oscar Reischau of the Chicago Daily News reported, Jackson certainly demonstrated that a World Series makes little difference to him. He played up to his usual standard. Former Major Leaguer Fred Luteris testified, Jackson had compiled a wonderful batting average against the Cincinnati Reds pitching staff that had been the strongest in baseball. The American statistician reported that sabermetrics proved that Joe played up to his full potential. Later in his article, Lamb continues, quote, statistics are always malleable, subject to partisan manipulation. More rigorous examination on how the 1919 World Series unfolded yields a damning assessment, end quote. But Lamb continues, during the first 5 games, the outer limit of the fixed duration in most minds, cleanup batter Jackson notably underproduced, failing to drive in a single White Sox run. Lamb argues that Joe hit .316, 6 for 19 in the first 5 games, but it was soft because he had no RBIs. While Lamb writes, quote, Joe was hardly without accomplices in underachievement, end quote. He neglects to mention the stats of the honest, the clean Sox, the honest players, Eddie and Shano Collins, Ray Schalk, Nemo Leibold, Eddie Murphy, and Bert Lynn, who had a combined 130, 7 for 54. And that included 2 Hall of Famers, Eddie Collins and Ray Schalk. They went 7 for 54 with just 1 RBI. So Joe in 19 at-bats had 6 hits. They had 7 and 54. Joe didn't drive in any runs, but they only drove in 1. In fact, the White Sox as a team were only credited with 4 RBIs in the first 5 games. Ray Cracker Schalk, the Hall of Famer, he had 1. The other 3 were by the fixed ringleader, Chick Gandil. That's right. Chick Gandil drove in 3 of the 4 runs in those games. Jacob Pomreinke stated in a Zoom conference that the, quote, Reds had a much deeper pitching staff than the White Sox. They had 5 top-line starters, and the White Sox were relying on only two in the best-of-9 World Series. I am of the opinion that the Reds had a very good chance to beat the White Sox had the series been played on the level, end quote. Christy Mathewson, one of the greatest pitchers of all time, said before the series he thought the Reds had a real chance to win that because they had such a terrific pitching staff. I will now proceed to do my own rigorous examination of Joe's performance in those first 5 games. In Game 1, he went 0 for 4, but he did score in the second inning. He scored a run, making it 1-1 at that time, and tying the game. I recall manager Al Lopez, who managed the Cleveland Indians to a pennant in 1954 and the White Sox in 1959, and who is in the Hall of Fame, Al Lopez. I recall hearing him say in an interview that he thought runs scored was the most important stat in baseball, and Joe scored 2 of the 6 runs the White Sox scored in those first 5 games. And he scored what proved to be the winning run in Game 3. In Game 2, Joe went 3 for 4. Therefore, he was 3 for 8 in the first 2 games. It's a .375 average. In the remaining 6 games, he also hit .375. In Game 3, he went 2 for 3. People debate whether or not Game 3 was fixed. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. The fixed players may have been trying to fix it, but Kerr pitched so well that the White Sox won anyway. But it's debated. But Joe went 2 for 3. That's in that Game 3. That's 5 for 7 in 2 consecutive World Series games. A partial list of baseball greats who never matched or bettered Joe's performance in 2 consecutive World Series games, minimum of 5 at-bats, includes Ty Cobb, Honus Wagner, Rogers Hornsby, Tris Speaker, Lou Gehrig, Mel Ott, Eddie Collins, Joe DiMaggio, Ted Williams, Stan Musial, Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Roberto Clemente, and even Pete Rose. And I said that's just a partial list. I'm sure if I did more research, I'd find many other baseball greats who never accomplished what Joe did in those 2 games. And Babe Ruth did it. He accomplished this rare and remarkable feat, but it took him 35 games in his World Series career to accomplish it. It took Joe just 9. And yet Lamb's rigorous examination leads to a damning assessment. I don't understand it. And in Game 4, Joe led off the second inning with a double. That means that he went 6 for 8, again, against the best pitching staff in the National League. And Loderis at the trial said they were the strongest pitching staff in baseball. So he's 6 for 8. 6 for 8. And in his next at-bat, he hit one of his trademark blue darters, a rocket to infielder Maury Rath, who had trouble handling it. It was hit so hard. And it was initially ruled a hit, making Joe 7 for 9. 7 for 9. But unfortunately, it was later changed to an error. Maybe it could have gone either way. I don't know. But often when balls are hit so hard, I mean, back in those days, they didn't measure velocity like they do now. But anyway, they used to say Joe Jackson hit the ball harder than anybody. And I wouldn't be surprised if he hit the ball over 100 miles an hour. That's why Rath had such a problem handling it. And if it had not been changed to an error, Joe would have had 13 hits. And his average would have been 406. And everybody who knows baseball, 406 is people think of Ted Williams when they think of 406. And Williams was a strong supporter. So an interesting coincidence if that had happened. And they used to say, or a description of a blue darter, I have that here. It says, quote, a line drive that is hit with such speed and low trajectory that it appears almost invisible to the human eye, making it very difficult for fielders to catch. The term was used to describe line drives hit by players such as Shoeless Joe Jackson. So even if Joe's screaming blue darter, almost invisible to the human eye, was correctly scored in error. Jackson was clearly trying his best. I mean, if he's hitting that ball that hard, yeah, he wasn't laying down. And needless to say, I do not agree with Mr. Lamb that a rigorous examination of Joe's performance in the first 5 games leads to a damning assessment. In an ESPN documentary about the scandal, official Major League Baseball historian Jerome Holtzman also spoke disparagingly about Joe's performance in those first 5 games. Gene Carney wrote that, quote, when Holtzman trotted out Joe's batting stats for the first 5 games as if it constituted proof of Joe's guilt, I was stunned. Someone should have interrupted. Mr. Holtzman, Jackson's performance in those games was still better than Hall of Famers Eddie Collins and Ed Roche. Were they lying down too? It was just sloppy. That's what Carney wrote. It was just sloppy, end quote. Carney also wrote, quote, the only condition under which anyone could conclude Joe played to lose would be to assume Joe could get hits at will and make outs at will. A proposal that is patently absurd, end quote. It's my belief that no player in the history of baseball, alive or dead, would be so disparaged after going 5 or 7 in 2 consecutive World Series games, a truly rare and remarkable feat, and then go 6 for 8 against a great pitching staff and almost 7 for 9. And to say there's a damning assessment of his performance, this would only be said about Joe Jackson. As Ted Williams said, it's unfair. Ted Williams also said about hitting, the hardest thing to do in sports, without question, is to hit a round ball with a round bat squarely. Clearly Joe hit the ball very squarely. Squarely as a person could, I think. My favorite player growing up was Ted Kluszewski, Big Clue. He was a wonderful hitter and an equally wonderful hitting coach for the Big Red Machine in the 1970s. Clue had a quote that I like where he said, how hard is hitting? Imagine going into a pitch black room that you've never been in before, full of furniture, and trying not to bump into anything. Hitting is harder than that. I think anybody who's played baseball from Pee Wee League on up to the major leagues, it's hard to hit. You go 6 for 8, 7 for 9, and have it be disparaged. Don't understand. Shoeless Joe biographer David Fleitz said on the previously mentioned ESPN documentary that, quote, it seemed like Joe did most of his damage with the bat when the games were already out of hand, end quote. I definitely would challenge that. Game 2, again, Joe went 3 for 4. The Reds won 4-2. That game was never out of hand. Game 3, went 2 for 3. They may or may not have been trying to fix it, the crooked players, but went 2 for 3. That game was never out of hand. The Sox won. Game 4, he went 1 for 4 and almost 2 for 4. That's the game when he hit the blue darter that was changed from a hit to an error. And the White Sox lost 2-0. That game was never out of hand. Game 6 and 7, the White Sox won, so those games were out of hand. Game 8 is the final game of the series. Is a controversial game. Some people think it was one of the fixed games. Others do not. Others think the White Sox were trying to win that game. Joe hit the only home run in the World Series in that game. As Fleitz points out, Joe hit his solo home run when his team was down 5-0. It's true, they were down 5-0, but it was only the bottom of the third. 2 outs in the bottom of the third. Joe hits a home run, and now it's 5-1. And it seems like when teams are behind by 5 runs or whatever in the early innings, baseball announcers usually and often say the team has to start chipping away, get back, have a chance. If they start chipping away, they could still win the game. And Joe was chipping away. He got a solo home run. It's 5-1, bottom of the third. Game is not out of hand. I don't think anybody should feel that. I think it was the great Johnny Bench. I remember hearing him say, I think it was Bench, who said that he always felt his team was still in the game if going into the ninth inning they were down by 4 runs or less. And because it could still tie the game, the team could still tie the game with a grand slam. So he felt if going into the ninth inning you're down by 4 runs, you're still in the game. I think in the third inning, the bottom of the third, if you're down by 4, you still have a chance. You have a good chance if you start chipping away. Dr. Corey Franklin, in an opinion piece that appeared recently in the Chicago Tribune, wrote that Joe hit the only home run when the Reds had an insurmountable lead. 5-0 in the bottom of the third and 5-1 after he hits the home run. That's not an insurmountable lead. I don't know how anyone could think that. Plenty of teams come back down 5-1 in the early innings, especially, even late innings. Only when Joe got a double, I think it was in the bottom of the eighth, when the White Sox were down 10-1, he got a double that drove in 2 runs. That's the only hit out of the 12 he got that could be described as doing damage when the game is out of hand. That's the only one. And I can guarantee it. I mean, Joe was damned if he did, damned if he didn't. Getting a double like he did when they're down 10-1, and people just despair. Joe, game was out of hand. It doesn't mean anything. Got a double then. But if he didn't get a double, if he didn't get a hit, they'd say, oh, he left 2 more runners on in scoring position. Maybe they could have gotten back in the game. There was still a little bit of time. Teams have come back. That would only happen to Joe Jackson. People would despair. So he was damned if he did, damned if he didn't. They'd say, And Joe also just missed a second home run in that game. He flew out to the center field wall. And so he almost hit 2 home runs in that game. And, there is much disagreement about whether or not Game 8 was fixed or not. Elliot Asanoff, in his book 8 Men Out, invented a hitman character he called Harry F., who threatened Lefty Williams with bodily harm for either he or his wife if he didn't lose the game, and he better lose it early in the first inning if possible. And Hugh Fullerton, the Sabre 8 Men Out Myths Project, 8 Myths Out Project, contends there is, quote, little evidence to substantiate the claim that Lefty Williams' life was in danger, end quote. John Flagler, a distinguished journalist and a professor at the prestigious Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, where he taught courses specializing in magazine writing, wrote an article entitled Requiem for a Southpaw that was written shortly after Lefty Williams died in 1959. And in the article, Flagler stated that he was a neighbor of the Williams family when he was a child in the early 1930s. And he said he was told by Lyria Williams, Lefty's wife, of the threats that Lefty Williams was threatened before Game 8. Elliot Asanoff also stated in the ESPN documentary that he indicated that Lyria also told him of the threats. Henry Seymour wrote in his book that gambler Billy Maharg intimated that Williams had been threatened with foul play if he did not lose Game 8. And many years later, his wife confirmed this. Hugh Fullerton said he was told by gamblers before Game 8 that, quote, it would be the biggest first inning you ever saw. The Reds scored 4 in the first inning off Williams. I think he only pitched 1/3 of an inning and was charged with 4 runs. And if the White Sox had won Game 8, Dickie Kerr, who had already won 2 games, who was one of the honest players, was scheduled to would have pitched in Game 9. So it's possible if they won Game 8, they might well have won the World Series. And how would the gamblers have responded to that? Gamblers who won hundreds of thousands of dollars betting on the Reds. What if they lost hundreds of thousands of dollars? I mean, the players would have been signing their own death warrant, I think. They would have had to look over the over their shoulder for the remainder of their lives. And not only their lives could be at risk, but those of their wives and children. And Arnold Rothstein, who was known as a big bankroll and is generally considered to be the financier of the fix, how would he have reacted? He was a violent man. He himself was murdered a few years later, I think in 1926 or something, when he reneged on a gambling debt. I mean, they played pretty tough, these guys, and the Black Sox players knew that. I think Gene Carney wrote, I think he said that both Seacott and Williams were afraid that they might get shot while they were on the mound. And Carney wrote, quote, "What happens when ordinary people start fiddling with the big money plans of the underworld? Gamblers were involved, and there would be some risk in doing anything that would thwart their plans." Boy, that's an understatement. Some risk. There definitely would be risk. Carney goes on. Joe Jackson apparently just made up his mind, decided to go out and play the best series he could, and hope that they did not kill him. End quote. Gangster Frank Costello said that if Joe had talked, he would not have made it home alive. I somehow think that, sometimes think that Joe's detractors argue that Game 8 was not fixed, to avoid having to explain why he had performed so well in Game 8, final game. Dr. Franklin wrote in his article, his opinion piece, that Joe made suspect plays during the World Series. Charles Comiskey testified that, quote, Joe played good ball, nor did he suspect Jackson of crooked play, that he observed nothing dishonest in Jackson's World Series play. Team captain Eddie Collins, who was the field general, who was in charge of positioning the players. He was described as the greatest field general in baseball history, in charge of positioning Joe and the other fielders. He said that Joe always did everything right. Always did everything right. But Jackson's detractors think that Joe was guilty, no matter how he played in the World Series. Pomeranke stated during the SABR Northern New England chapter meeting, quote, "There is no question whatsoever that Joe took the money. Anybody that thinks that Jackson was not involved and did not take the money, it's not true. He absolutely took the money," end quote. We who support Joe, and even Joe himself, admit he took the money. You know, I personally know of no one who denies this. I've been researching and reading about this for years. I can't recall anyone denying he took the money. And the judge at the civil trial said it wasn't in dispute. He said in his charge to the jury that both plaintiff Jackson and defendant Comiskey were that was not a subject with which they were in dispute. They concede he took the money. What was in dispute, was when he took the money. As Gary Libicari has written, quote, "To simply say that Joe was guilty because he took the gambler's money given to him by Lefty Williams is a superficial reading of a complex story," end quote. I think that's well put. I agree with that. Joe testified before the Cook County grand jury on September 28, 1920, that Lefty gave him the money after Game 4, the night before the team was to return to Cincinnati for Game 5. At his civil trial in 1924, Joe changed his story, testifying that Williams gave him the bribe after Game 8, the final game of the series. He said he argued with Lefty, who was his best friend on the team. And Williams had told him that the money was for the use of his name, apparently to entice the gamblers to try to get them to give the crooked players more money. They had to assure them that the best hitter on the team was in on the fix. Told his southpaw friend, Williams, that he had a hell of a nerve to use his name without his permission. Lefty threw the money on the floor, and Joe testified that in his anger, he stormed out of the room. Williams also testified before the Cook County grand jury. He testified the next day on September 29, 1920, that he threw the money down after Game 4 the night before they were to return to Cincinnati for Game 5. Later in his grand jury testimony that same day on September 29th, Lefty changed his story, testifying, quote, "We were supposed to lose the first 2 games, and after the first 2 games, we were to get our money. But I never got a nickel until the last 2 games were played. I believe, therefore, that Williams gave Jackson the money after Game 8. I will explain further why I believe this in my next presentation, part 2, where I go into greater depth about Joe Jackson's grand jury testimony." In her pre-1924 civil trial deposition, Joe's wife, Katie, testified that she saw Lefty hand her husband the $5,000, which he put into his pocket. When asked where she was when Williams entered the hotel suite, it was a suite of rooms, it wasn't just one room. She said that she was in her room. It is my belief that Joe argued with Williams. Katie wasn't there when she was in her room. He argued with Williams while she was in her room and stormed out and went into the room that he shared with Katie. He, shortly after that, I guess he told her what had happened, and Katie left the room with him, and she saw Williams hand the money to Joe, and he put it in his pocket. Joe admitted he put it into his pocket. I think in his civil trial, he admitted it. And Lefty Williams stated in his pre-civil trial deposition that Joe did not give him permission to use his name, and Joe did not know his name was being used in an attempt to get more money from the gamblers. At his civil trial, Shoeless Joe testified that he took the money the next day, October 10th, 1919, to owner Comiskey's office and had the door slammed in his face by team secretary Harry Grabiner, who told him Comiskey would not see him and shouted at him to go away. Joe's detractors have long expressed skepticism that he tried to show the bribe money to the White Sox owner. At the Sabre Black Sox Centennial Symposium, Chairman Pomeranke said, quote, "There are some reports, a little bit of evidence about Shoeless Joe Jackson possibly reporting the fix either before the World Series or after the World Series to either manager Kid Gleason or owner Charles Comiskey. But it's very thin evidence. It's something that Shoeless Joe only said many years later, but his story changed and the details changed, so it's very difficult to know for sure whether he told Gleason or Comiskey," end quote. I disagree with Pomeranke's comments that there is only very thin evidence that Joe reported the fix, or at least tried to show the money to Comiskey after the World Series, and that it's something that Shoeless Joe only said many years later, and the details changed and the story changed. But it wasn't many years later. Joe consistently testified that he went to Comiskey's office the day after the series ended, on October 10th, 1919, both during his 1920 grand jury testimony, the month that the scandal broke. So it wasn't many years later. He's testifying that he went to his office, Comiskey's office, the day after the series ended in his grand jury testimony in September of 1920. He also testified to that effect at his 1924 civil trial. Indeed, at the 1924 civil trial, owner Comiskey verified that Joe did come to his office. He did not summon Joe to his office. He came on his own the day after the World Series ended. And Comiskey testified that Joe waited an hour and that he did not see him. So he verifies Joe came to his office the day after the series ended. William Lamb wrote regarding Shoeless Joe's claim that he tried to show Comiskey the bribe money that he had received from Lefty Williams. Mr. Lamb wrote, quote, "Jackson's insistence that he had tried to turn over the bribe money to Comiskey also rang false." Rang false? How could it ring false? I don't think it rings false. Joe testified before the grand jury that, as I said many times by now, that he went to Comiskey's office the day after the series. He said that the grand jury, and He said it again at his civil trial, and Comiskey verified it at the civil trial that Joe did indeed come. So how does that ring false? He was trying to see Comiskey, and I believe trying to show him the bribe money. I'm sure. Anyway, Donald Grobman, Joe's biographer, has written that, quote, Comiskey would not see Joe the morning after the World Series ended because the cover-up was clearly underway, end quote. In a letter dated November 11th, 1919, Charles Comiskey wrote Joe that, quote, there has been a great deal of adverse talk in which your name has been mentioned, reflecting on your integrity in the recent World Series. Would gladly pay your expenses to Chicago if you wish to come on in reference to the matter pertaining to the talk emanating from the World Series, end quote. Joe, via his wife, since he couldn't write, wrote back on November 15th, 1919, probably immediately as soon as he got the letter, he wrote him back, where he indicated his surprise to hear that, I'll quote him, surprised that my name has been connected with any scandal in the recent World Series, as I think my play proved that I did all I could to win. I will only be too glad to come to Chicago and clear my name. Let me hear from you as to when you want me to come to Chicago, end quote. Unsurprisingly, Comiskey brushed him off, never responded to that letter. These letters were presented in evidence at Joe's 1924 civil trial. Joe and Katie Jackson waited 2 months before depositing the money in the bank, which indicates to me that they weren't sure didn't know what to do with it. He had tried to show the $5,000 to Comiskey the day after the series after receiving it, and I am also convinced he would have brought it with him to Chicago if the owner had responded to his November 15th, 1919 letter. He still had it. He hadn't deposited it in the bank. I bet he would have gone and taken the money with him and showed it to Comiskey. But because he received no response, Joe decided on December 1st, Joe and Katie, that they might as well bank it. Joe testified at his civil trial that Lefty, quote, didn't want the damn stuff, the $5,000, and I thought just this way. That lousy so-called gambling outfit had used my name. I might as well have their money as for Williams, end quote. The Jacksons still had not made any withdrawals by February 1920. They hadn't taken any money out of the bank when Sox Secretary Grabiner traveled to Savannah at Comiskey's behest to try to sign Joe to a multi-year contract. Grabiner had never traveled to Georgia before to try to sign Joe. Joe testified that he confronted Grabiner, asking why he had been so mean to him, slamming the door in his face, and that when he tried to, and that he had written a letter. Why hadn't they responded to the letter where he offered to come back and tell what he knew to clear his name? And that was just a mere month after the World Series ended. And Grabiner, and Joe asked him, after confronting him, what he should do with the money, with the bribe money. Grabiner said, quote, as long as that bunch of bums used your name, you did the only sensible thing in keeping it, end quote. I believe that Comiskey and his people wanted Shoeless Joe to keep the money because he would then be implicated and less likely to expose the Comiskey cover-up. I'll speak more about this, especially in my next part. The Jacksons didn't start to make withdrawals from their bank account to pay primarily to pay his sister's hospital bills until March of 1920. So after being advised by Grabiner that he could keep it. So, they didn't know what to do with the money, told them to keep it. So I guess they felt they'd put the dirty money to good use by paying his sister's extensive hospital bills. Grabiner testified that he did not discuss the World Series with Shoeless Joe during that visit to Savannah in February of 1920, which to me is not at all credible. Jackson must have brought up his attempts to see Comiskey the day after the series ended when he went to his office and the letter that he wrote offering to return. He most certainly brought that up with Grabiner, that they discussed the series. It's not believable at all that he didn't mention those things to Grabiner. And Grabner himself had initially testified during the civil trial that he didn't know about Joe's letter, but later admitted that he had seen it. End part one. The subject of my next video will be, as I've said, Shoeless Joe's September 28th, 1920 grand jury testimony. Thank you.